Now, in the spinal nerves, remember those spinal nerves are branching off of the spinal cord, so the spinal nerves themselves are part of the peripheral nervous system. There are 4 different types of nerve fibers that form each spinal nerve. There are somatic sensory fibers. These come from the skin, and it's information about the temperature you're experiencing, pressure on your skin, positions of your muscles and joints. There's visceral sensory fibers, so from your gut wall and blood vessels, and this is sending important information to your, blood pressure and about what your digestive tract is doing, and it's sending that information to your central nervous system, but you are usually not consciously aware of it. If you are consciously aware of it, it means that something bad is happening. Um, You've got visceral motor fibers, which are the motor neurons that are controlling muscles and glands in your GI tract and in your blood vessels, because remember, you've got smooth muscle in your blood vessels that can, you know, relax or contract, and so they can send more blood to certain capillaries or less blood to certain capillaries, because especially when you're resting, your cardiac output is definitely not enough to fully supply all of the capillaries in your body. So you're constantly turning some on and turning others off. Part of that fight or flight response is to increase the blood flow so that you can start sending a lot more blood supply to capillaries primarily in your muscles. So the visceral motor fibers that are in the spinal nerves are basically under unconscious control. You don't have the same kind of direct control over them as you do the last type of fiber. The somatic motor fibers are going out to striated muscles or skeletal muscles, and you do have direct conscious control over those. This is what these spinal nerves look like. So if you take a look at this drawing here, you can see the actual vertebrae stacked up, and the pink parts are the intervertebral discs. That's actually the only part of a notochord that a vertebrate still has left, and it's basically just cushioning pads between the body of the bodies of the vertebrae so that they're not grinding against each other. And here is the nerve cord itself. This is the spinal cord. And then branching off of it, you have the spinal nerves. And here they are branching off. And the way that this works, because the nerve cord is actually really protected by the vertebrae. If you take a look at the picture in the upper right hand side, the spinal cord is right in here, but you can't see it at all because it's basically completely surrounded by bone. Even though your backbone is still flexible, it really protects it well. To get those spinal nerves out, you need an opening. And the way it works is you basically have half of that opening in one vertebrae and half of that opening in the next one, and when they come together, it forms the hole that allows the spinal nerves to exit and enter from the spinal cord. You also can get problems there. So here you've got a herniated disc where that intervertebral disc has ruptured and it's pushing on a spinal nerve. And this can be incredibly painful. You can get numbness and lots of pain in certain parts of the body. And of course, where you're feeling the pain has nothing to do with where the actual problem is, because you're affecting well, hopefully just a single spinal nerve, and you can diagnose which spinal nerve it is based on where the pain is and what parts of the body are affected, because of course there's a direct mapping. Now, if you look at the bottom picture, this is showing, because this is a slice through, so you can see where the spinal nerve exits through that notch there in the bony vertebrae that allows it to enter and exit. This is a bit of a close-up of the spinal cord with the spinal nerves branching off. And you can actually see an important feature of chordates here. Remember, you have a dorsal hollow nerve cord. See the central canal? Your nerve cord is still hollow. It's got a canal in there full of cerebrospinal fluid. And of course, you have larger openings in the brain that are full of cerebrospinal fluid. They're called ventricles. But anyway, so that's the hollowness right there. And you can see that when you slice through the spinal cord, you kind of have this odd pattern. You've got white matter surrounding this gray matter that's kind of shaped like a butterfly. Remember, wherever you have gray matter, you've got nerve cell bodies there. So that means you have synapses there, because wherever there are nerve cell bodies, the dendrites are they're not very long, so they're going to be right there. And you have synapses with the dendrites and with the nerve cell bodies themselves. So you have synapses where you have gray matter. The white matter that's surrounding the gray matter are myelinated axons. So those are just communications fibers. There are no synapses out there in the white matter. It's sort of like, optic fibers, just carrying data. It's not doing any processing on the data. And you can kind of see how you've got two roots. The dorsal root that has the sensory neurons in it joins up with the ventral root, which is where you've got the neurons for the motor neurons, or at least the axons of the motor neurons, and then they join together right there to form the spinal nerve. So outside of the, when you see the spinal nerve emerging from the vertebral column, it's just one piece, because these two roots join together. It's covered up by the bones of the vertebral column, and you can't really see it. And I should mention, let's see, one other thing. So in the ventral root, you've got the axons of the motor neurons. The nerve cell bodies are here in this gray matter up in here, because remember, they're sending signals out like this in that direction. They're motor neurons. The sensory neurons are bringing information back in like that, and they have their nerve cell bodies in a ganglion. It's called the dorsal root ganglion. And again, you can't see it unless you actually get the bone out of the way, because it's protected by bone, but that's where the nerve cell bodies are there. This is showing a simple reflex arc, because remember, you've got sensors in your muscles, in your tendons, and in your joints. It's telling the positions of the joints and how much strain is on different muscles in your body. And a lot of the control of these muscles has to happen very fast for you to maintain your posture. And when you're walking, if something happens, you need to make very fast adjustments to what these muscles are doing to keep from just falling down. And so you're seeing here the test that the doctor will do to you, right? They whack your patellar ligament right there, just below your patella, with a pointed rubber hammer. And what that does is it very suddenly stretches the muscles that are attached to it, which are these quadriceps muscles up here in your upper thigh. So it stretches those muscles. So as soon as that happens, there's a sensory receptors there that send a signal back to your central nervous system. Here's the dorsal root ganglion where the nerve cell body is. Sends it back out into the gray matter in your spinal cord, where there are synapses with some other neurons. Now notice the little green one that's right there is an interneuron. That neuron is entirely in the central nervous system. On this side, we have a sensory neuron, the blue one, with a synapse directly to the nerve cell body of a motor neuron, which is the red one. And so that signal comes in, goes right through here, and makes this muscle contract. Now, the muscles on the other side of your thigh are the flexor muscles that are making your knee flex. And again, you've got an interneuron, so there's a synapse here, an interneuron, and another synapse with a motor neuron, and that sends a signal down to those muscles to contract. Now, that signal arrives a fraction of a second later, because you got to go through two synapses for the signal to get through that. And what these muscles are doing is really, or I shouldn't say the muscles, but the muscles in coordination with these neurons, is to just, it's there to help you maintain your posture. Now, they're leaving out a lot of details. You can imagine, okay, well, this would work, right? Just the way it's drawn here. But of course, you are also aware that this is happening. So there are other connections that go out into the white matter and send information up to your brain that tells you that this is happening. And of course, you can suppress it a little bit if you're really trying hard, but you can't really fully eliminate it, because some of this is pretty automatic. But this is happening at the level of the spinal cord because it has to happen really fast. If this sensory information were just sent to your spinal cord, then up to your brain processes it, sends a signal down for the muscles to do something. By the time all that happens, you're already on the ground because you just didn't react fast enough. So this is part of this automatic system that's there to help us, keep our body under coordination when you're moving around. Now, the brain itself is really complicated, and we're only just beginning to understand it. So, of course, this is a human brain, and one of the obvious things that you see when you look at especially a human brain is that it's got a lot of folds on the surface. Other mammals also have folds, but most mammals don't have as many as we do. Some of the cetaceans have a more folded brain than we do, but for the most part, if this were a cat's brain is very similar to our brain, but it doesn't have nearly as many folds on it. It's a lot smoother. And whenever you see something like that, you should be thinking, okay, we're trying to get around a surface to volume ratio problem here. And what's happening is that you are doing a huge amount of data processing on the surface of your brain. And so if you need to do more data processing, you need more surface area. Well, you could have a brain that's bigger, that'll have more surface area, but of course then you have to have a bigger skull and a bigger head and everything else. Or we can cheat the surface to volume ratio by just keeping the head and the brain the same overall size, but just changing the shape by folding it up. So we're increasing the surface area. So we'll start at the at the base of the brain. The base of the brain is doing the most basic functions that are really essential for life. As you move, physically higher up in the brain, you are getting to higher and higher functions, which may be important, but are not quite as fundamental as the functions that are being handled by the lower parts of the brain. So the brain stem is right at the base where the spinal cord is connecting with the brain, right down here. And the brain stem is controlling a lot of automatic activities that you are usually not paying very much attention to. Things like breathing, swallowing, walking, and you might think, well, these things are all voluntary. Yeah, they are, but you're not paying a detailed attention to everything that's going on, especially like when you're walking. If you think about it, you're not paying attention to exactly which muscles need to be contracted and to take a step and then to push off for the next step. A lot of that is actually being handled at an automatic level. The cerebellum is an interesting structure at the base of the brain. It also has a whole bunch of folds that give it extra surface area, but you can see the folding pattern actually looks very different. The cerebellum is where your balance is being controlled and your movements are being precisely coordinated. So it's higher up in the brain. If you want to get up from your chair and walk around, those impulses are being generated higher up in the brain. But exactly which muscles need to contract to make that happen and which ones need to relax, well, the signals from higher up in the brain are sent to the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is figuring out exactly which contractile units of each muscle need to be sent signals to make those movements happen. So the cerebellum is really just kind of coordinating a lot of things having to do with movement. And it's interesting because one of the arguments that I think is kind of fading away now, but one of the arguments for what causes consciousness is that, well, if you just have enough connections, right, enough synapses, you've got enough neurons connecting to enough other neurons, then consciousness just emerges from that. That's almost certainly not true. At least that's what the evidence says now. And actually, the cerebellum is an example of that, because the cerebellum has a massive number of neurons and a massive number of interconnections. There's no evidence that there's any consciousness at all residing in the cerebellum. It seems to be just, it's just like a computer. It's automatic. It's taking information and figuring out exactly what to do based on that information and then sending out the signals to make it happen. It's not deciding what to do at all. The thalamus and the hypothalamus you can't actually see in this picture because they're buried kind of in the center of the brain. And to be honest with you, they're both tiny and they don't really look like anything, but they are critically important parts of the brain and of the central nervous system. So they coordinate sleep-wake cycles. Your blood pressure is being regulated from that point. That's where your body's thermostat is. So if you want to, on a hot day, you could potentially make somebody feel cold by cooling off their hypothalamus. Sex drive is located there. So, and memories are not being formed there, but there's something about the formation of memories that requires this part of the brain to happen, because damage there will damage your ability to make new memories. So there's a lot going on there, and again, we don't really understand it, but there's an awful lot going on at that point. When you get higher up, most of what you're seeing are the two cerebral hemispheres, the cerebrum. This is where consciousness is located. So this is all of this folded surface that you see up here. And what's interesting about it, or one of the things that's interesting about it, is that, if you remember the spinal cord, you've got gray matter on the inside, kind of in the shape of a butterfly, and that gray matter is surrounded by white matter. Well, in the cerebrum, it's inside out. The gray matter is on the outside and the white matter is on the inside. So where you have gray matter, remember, that's where you've got synapses. That's where you've got connections between neurons. So that's where you've got some data processing capability in the nervous system. So here you've got the gray matter on the outer surface, and the white matter, the wiring that connects it, is all on the inside. So it's very convoluted, like I say, in higher primates especially. It's even more convoluted in some cetaceans. So there are animals that have a more convoluted brain than we do, but we're up there close to the top. And again, that's there to increase the surface area without massively increasing the volume of your skull. Now, in the early days, people thought that the brain was your consciousness was just kind of happening everywhere in the brain. And as time has gone on, we have realized that that is completely false. And there's still kind of a remnant of this idea out there, kind of a bizarre mutated fragment of it that says that, you only use 10% of your brain. Well, no, you use 100% of your brain. This is why if somebody gets shot in the head, it matters, because if you're only using 10% of your brain, 90% of the time it wouldn't matter, because it's just some dead weight that you're carrying around. But actually, we use every bit of our brain. We don't necessarily know the exact function of every bit at this point, but there is research being done to try to map out all the connections between all these neurons to figure out how the brain is actually able to process information. One of the first examples of how regions of brains have specific functions happened in the 1800s, and unfortunately I can't remember the name of the person who actually publicized this and did the research, but I can remember the name of the victim. The victim, or the research subject, was a guy named Phineas Gage, who worked on a railroad. And of course, in the old days, if you wanted to make a railroad track around the side of a rocky mountain, you didn't have jackhammers and all of that. Basically what they would do is drill a hole in a rock, and the drill, of course, is a metal rod that somebody's holding with their hands, and the other guy is hitting the end of it with a sledgehammer, and every time he hits it, the guy holding the rod rotates it a little bit, and that's how you drill your hole. When you get a good deep hole in there, you put some dynamite down in it, tamp it down with another rod, and then light it on fire and blow up the rock, and then you have to go in by hand with pickaxes and move the debris away. So very, very labor intensive. Phineas Gage was doing that, and when he was tamping in a piece of dynamite with the steel rod, the dynamite exploded and it drove the steel rod up underneath his jaw, behind, I think it was his left eye, and then out the top of his head. Now, surprisingly, it didn't kill him, but of course it did destroy part of the, the frontal lobe of his brain, and he was studied because it really changed his behavior. You know, a lot of people knew him, and they could tell the researchers what he was like before and what he was like after, and that was really one of the early indications that specific parts of the brain have specific functions, and it's really specific. You know, you just can't really think about something very well that you haven't evolved to think about. And this is one of the things, you know, like with global warming, it's one of the reasons that we're just killing ourselves with that rather than actually dealing with the problem and solving it. So what I want to do is show you now. This is the central sulcus. A groove is a sulcus in the brain. A gyrus is the hump. So usually you'll have a gyrus between two sulci. What I want to do is show you the mapping. Here's the central sulcus. This goes, now you're looking, if this were a person, their face would be here, just so you get that in the right orientation. So here's the central sulcus going up through, and of course it goes down on the other side, goes across the top of the head and then down the other side. And then you've got a gyrus behind it and one in front of it. Now what I want to do is show you how those sections of the brain map to the body, and they directly map to parts of your body. If you look at the diagram that's on the left-hand side, this is showing you the motor area, which is that gyrus right in front of the central sulcus. If you look at the diagrams below, you can kind of see where we're talking about. And you notice that at least the skeletal muscles in your body directly map to that part of the brain. And so you can go in, and of course brain surgeons do this because when they're going in, the brain is so complicated and so delicate, you know, you want to be sure you know where you are. So they go in with the patient, their head has a local anesthetic, so they're not feeling what's going on there, but they're going in and actually stimulating different parts of the brain. And so you can go and stimulate different parts of that motor area and make different parts of their body move. And like I say, there is a direct mapping. They call it a homunculus. It's like a little person that maps directly to that part of the brain. Now notice that areas where you've got a lot of fine muscle control have a lot of brain area devoted to them. So look at how much of the face, how much brain area the face control takes up. Look at how much brain area control of the hand takes up. Look at how little brain area is devoted to your arm or the trunk of your body or your legs. Not very much. You don't have a lot of fine control over those muscles. Same thing with your foot. Now, one of the things that I always think would be interesting would be to see this map for a chimp or a gorilla, because they still have a lot of dexterity with their feet. So I suspect that in their brains there's a lot more area devoted to the fine control of their feet, just like, you know, they have a lot of area devoted to the fine control of their hands. Now that's the motor area. This is the sensory area. So this is for some of these somatic senses. So, you know, you could, like the sense of touch. And again, that maps to the body. So again, notice how much area the face takes up on the brain. And actually, it isn't the whole face, it's distorted. The lips have a lot of brain space devoted to the sensory information that's coming in from that part of the body. Again, the hand has quite a bit of area. And here, for some reason, the foot, even though we don't have a lot of fine motor control over the foot, we have a lot of sensory information coming in from the foot, and that may have to do with kind of paying attention to what you're walking on as you're walking, if you were walking around barefoot. But anyway, so there's a direct mapping here. We don't really understand how consciousness works at this point. One thing that we do know is that consciousness is kind of an illusion, because you've got multiple consciousnesses working in different parts of the brain that kind of integrate into what feels like a single consciousness. And one of the ways that people think we might be able to develop an artificial intelligence without really understanding what's going on is by just making electronic models for certain brain circuitry. And if you make electronic models of enough brain circuitry and put them together in an architecture that's like a brain, then you might get it to start functioning like a brain, and you might get something that is, something, at least something analogous to consciousness. Anyway, all right, so we're not gonna go any more into this. This is a bottomless topic, so if you want to look into this more, there's a lot more to it than what we've covered here.